In 1938, charismatic labor organizer Elias Vance vanished from the maximum security wing of Blackwood Penitentiary. The official story, crafted by the warden himself, spoke of a brilliant escape. 41 years later, in 1979, the prison's demolition would reveal a far more sinister truth. His cell had been sealed from the outside, entombing a secret that was never meant to be found. The escape was a lie. The reality was a meticulously concealed murder buried deep within the fortress's stone heart. Where are you reading us from? Share your city and country in the comments before we continue this story. The year was 1938, and Blackwood Penitentiary stood as a monument to brutal efficiency, carved into the remote mountains of West Virginia. It was a place of stark contrasts, governed by Warden Alistair Finch. To the outside world, Finch was a visionary, a penal reformer celebrated in national newspapers for his progressive methods. He championed rehabilitation and order, presenting Blackwood as a model institution. This carefully constructed public image masked a much darker reality known only to those trapped within its walls. Inside Blackwood, Finch's word was absolute law. The progressive reforms were a facade for a system of total control, built on fear and intimidation. The guards moved with an unnerving discipline, their loyalty sworn not to the state, but to the warden himself. Inmates learned quickly that survival depended on silence and obedience. The warden's authority was unquestioned, his power unchecked, creating an isolated kingdom where he served as judge, jury, and, when he deemed it necessary, executioner. Elias Vance was unlike any other prisoner in Blackwood. He was not a thief or a killer, he was a political threat. A powerful labor organizer, Vance had been framed on charges of sedition for exposing deep-seated corporate corruption. His trial became a public spectacle where he relentlessly detailed the web of graft and exploitation that connected powerful industrialists directly to Warden Finch's network. His imprisonment was not meant to punish a crime, but to silence a voice that had become too loud. Even behind bars, Elias refused to be silenced. He saw Blackwood not as a prison, but as a new front in his war for justice. He began to methodically document the abuses within the institution, focusing on Warden Finch's most profitable secret, the use of inmate labor for his own personal financial gain. He gathered names, dates, and figures, smuggling out notes through sympathetic visitors. Vance was turning his cell into a command post, a dangerous act of defiance against the prison's absolute ruler. The tension between the two men became a palpable force within the prison. Finch, a man obsessed with his legacy and public perception, saw Vance as a direct threat to the empire he had built. He couldn't risk another public expose, especially one originating from inside his own fortress. The warden's warnings to Vance grew more frequent and menacing, culminating in a final chilling confrontation in the echoing corridor outside cell 1138, a promise of permanent silence. "Men who shout in the wilderness are never heard," Finch had hissed, his voice a low threat that carried more weight than any physical blow. It was a declaration, not a warning. Elias understood the finality in the warden's eyes. He knew his time was running out and that his investigation had pushed Finch into a corner from which he would lash out violently. The warden was a man who buried his problems, and Elias had just made himself the most significant problem of all. 1 week later, the midnight calm of Blackwood was shattered by the piercing wail of the escape siren. Lights flooded the prison yard as guards scrambled, their movements sharp and rehearsed. The news spread like wildfire through the cell blocks. Elias Vance, the defiant organizer from cell 1138, had done the impossible. He had escaped from the most secure prison in the state. The initial chaos seemed genuine, a frantic response to a major security breach that would tarnish the warden's pristine record. The scene in cell 1138 was a masterclass in deception. A single bar on the small high window was meticulously sawed through, the metal shavings carefully collected. A rope fashioned from braided bedsheets hung from the opening, swaying gently in the cold mountain air. It pointed toward the outer wall, a clear and undeniable path to freedom. It was a textbook escape, almost too perfect, as if staged for a photograph. The evidence was simple, direct, and completely misleading. Warden Finch personally led the initial stages of the investigation, his expression a mask of professional fury and embarrassment. He briefed the press with somber gravity, praising Vance's cunning while vowing to bring him to justice. He spoke of the prisoner's relentless determination, painting a picture of a man whose desire for freedom was so immense that he could overcome even Blackwood's legendary security. The narrative was set before the sun had even risen over the Appalachian peaks. A massive manhunt was launched across the rugged West Virginia terrain. State troopers, local deputies, and prison guards combed the dense forests and remote hollows for weeks. Bloodhounds were brought in, tracking scents that mysteriously vanished at the edge of the prison grounds. Despite the scale of the operation and the hundreds of men involved, not a single trace of Elias Vance was ever found. The search was extensive, well publicized, and strangely, completely fruitless from the very beginning. As weeks turned into months, the story of the escape solidified into legend. Elias Vance became a folk hero, the man who outsmarted the infallible Warden Finch and his impenetrable fortress. The official case file grew thicker with dead-end leads and unsubstantiated sightings from neighboring states, but the investigation eventually went cold. The state quietly closed the case, officially declaring Vance a fugitive at large, his ultimate fate a mystery left to speculation and campfire stories. For the Vance family, the news brought a complex and painful form of closure. They were left with the ambiguous legacy of an ancestor who was either a brilliant escape artist or a man who had met a grim end in the wilderness. They clung to the story of his freedom as it was the only version offered to them. The legend of the Great Escape became a part of their family history, a tale of defiance passed down through generations, masking the raw, unanswered questions that lingered just beneath the surface. The community, too, absorbed the official narrative. The escape became a part of local folklore, a testament to the untamable human spirit. It served as a cautionary tale for some and a story of inspiration for others. Warden Finch, after the initial public embarrassment, skillfully used the incident to argue for even tighter security measures, further cementing his reputation as a dedicated and forward-thinking administrator. The event, in a twisted way, ultimately bolstered his authority and control. Over the years, Blackwood Penitentiary continued its operations, its dark stone walls holding countless secrets. The story of Elias Vance was occasionally retold by veteran guards to frighten new inmates, a ghost story about the one man who got away. Cell 1138 was repaired and put back into circulation, its brief moment of fame fading into the mundane routine of prison life. The sawed bar was replaced, the memory of the sheet rope erased, and the truth locked away more securely than any prisoner. The official record was clear. Elias Vance was a fugitive. His name was added to national wanted lists, a ghost in the system. The meticulous evidence he had gathered against Warden Finch was dismissed as the desperate slander of a convicted criminal. With Vance gone, the allegations of corruption faded away, and Finch's reputation emerged from the incident stronger than ever. The warden had successfully turned a potential disaster into a demonstration of his command, silencing his greatest threat forever. The Vance family lived with the shadow of his disappearance for decades. His wife passed away, never knowing for sure what happened, and his son grew up with the myth of a father he barely remembered. The story of the escape was a hollow comfort, a narrative that never quite fit the man they knew. Elias was a fighter, but he was also a man of principle, fleeing into obscurity, Abandoning his family and his cause seemed a profound betrayal of everything he stood for. Within the prison's aging walls, the truth remained dormant. The guards who knew something, or suspected it, grew old and retired, taking their secrets with them. The institution itself began to decay, its methods falling out of favor as the world changed around it. The era of Warden Finch and his absolute rule came to a close, but his legacy as a stern but fair reformer was etched into the state's historical records, a testament to a well-managed lie. The carefully staged escape was Finch's masterstroke. It provided a simple, dramatic, and satisfying conclusion to the problem of Elias Vance. It eliminated the man, discredited his work, and transformed him from a martyr into a common runaway. It was an act of profound narrative control, a story so compelling that no one felt the need to question it. The warden had not just disposed of a body, he had erased a man's true history and replaced it with a fiction of his own making. Time buried the event under layers of new stories and new histories. The world moved on, and the mystery of Elias Vance's disappearance became a cold case, a footnote in the long and brutal history of Blackwood Penitentiary. The wound for the Vance family never truly healed. It simply scarred over, a permanent reminder of a story that felt incomplete. The absence of a body meant the absence of certainty, leaving them adrift in a sea of speculation for over 40 years. The prison itself was eventually decommissioned in the 1970s, deemed too old and too costly to maintain. It stood empty for years, a hulking ruin on a lonely mountainside, its corridors silent for the first time in a century. The state decided to demolish the structure, to tear down the symbol of an outdated and cruel form of justice. It was an act of civic progress, meant to clear the way for a new future and erase a dark past. The demolition crew that arrived in 1979 saw only a decaying building of stone and steel. They had no knowledge of its history, of the thousands of lives that had been contained and broken within its walls. To them, it was just a job. They were there to tear down walls, not to uncover the secrets hidden behind them. They were instruments of destruction, unaware that they were about to become agents of discovery. For 4 decades, the story of Elias Vance's daring escape was accepted as fact, a testament to one man's unbreakable will to be free. The legend was set in stone, a permanent part of the region's history, told and retold until it became indistinguishable from the truth. But the real story was not one of freedom, it was one of silence. Sealed behind a wall of brick and lies, patiently waiting for the thunderous sound of its own destruction. What the world had accepted as a clever escape was, in fact, a cold and calculated execution. The truth had not run free into the wilderness. It had been entombed, suffocated, and left to decay in the darkness of cell 1138. The legend of the fugitive was a carefully constructed tombstone placed over a crime that was meant to remain buried forever. But some secrets are too heavy for time to hold, and this one was about to be unearthed. The year is 1979. 41 years of silence had settled over the legend of Elias Vance, turning history into myth. Blackwood Penitentiary, long since abandoned, was now a hollow carcass being picked apart by demolition crews. The thunderous crash of falling stone and the grinding shriek of stressed metal were the prison's final death rattles. For the men of the wrecking crew, it was just another job, a dirty, dangerous task of erasing a monument of human misery from the landscape. They knew nothing of the ghosts that lingered, nor the single monumental secret the prison still held within its crumbling heart. The work was methodical, brutal, and loud. Day after day, walls that had contained thousands of men were reduced to rubble. The crew moved through the cell blocks with professional detachment, their sledgehammers and crowbars indifferent to the history etched into the concrete. They were dismantling a fortress, not excavating a tomb. The maximum security wing, a place once defined by its oppressive silence and absolute control, was now a chaotic symphony of destruction. It was here, amidst the dust and debris, that a routine demolition would unexpectedly halt, brought to a dead stop by an impossible discovery. A foreman named Hank Kowalski, a veteran of a dozen such jobs, was the first to notice the anomaly. On the third floor of the maximum security block, along a corridor of identical cell doors, he saw something that made no sense. A section of the hallway wall, roughly the size of a cell entrance, was bricked over. The masonry was different, cruder, less precise than the expert stonework of the original 19th century construction. It was a patch, a clumsy seal, where there should have been a steel door. It wasn't on any of the official blueprints he had studied. He ran a gloved hand over the rough mortar, his brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't a repair. It was a deliberate concealment. The bricks were newer, their color slightly off from the surrounding aged stone. It felt wrong, an architectural lie in a building, made of hard, unyielding truths. He called his team over, their heavy machinery falling silent for the first time that day. The sudden quiet that descended upon the corridor was heavy and expectant. Something was behind that wall, something that had been intentionally and permanently walled off from the rest of the prison. Driven by a mixture of professional curiosity and a primal sense of unease, Hank made a decision. He ordered his men to break it down. The first blow of the sledgehammer against the wall echoed like a gunshot through the empty prison. With each subsequent strike, bricks cracked and mortar crumbled, releasing a fine powder of red dust that hung in the air like a bloody mist. They were breaking a seal that had been undisturbed for decades, peeling back a layer of history that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. The air itself seemed to grow colder, heavier. Finally, with a loud groan, a large section of the brickwork gave way, tumbling inward and revealing a gaping black hole. A wave of foul, stagnant air rushed out, a smell of profound decay and long-forgotten confinement that made the hardened crewmen recoil. It was the smell of a place without light, without air, without hope. It was the smell of a tomb. After letting the space ventilate, Hank shone a powerful flashlight into the darkness, its beam cutting through the thick swirling dust to illuminate the scene within, a scene that would be seared into his memory forever. Inside was not an empty storage space or a forgotten maintenance closet. It was a prison cell. Cell 1138. A rusted metal cot stood against the far wall. A thin, rotted mattress barely clinging to its frame. A tin cup lay on the floor, coated in a thick layer of grime and corrosion. But it was the occupant of the cot that caused the men to gasp in unison, their tough exteriors cracking under the weight of the horrific sight. Lying on the mattress, draped in the tattered remains of a prison uniform, was a human skeleton. The bones were yellowed with age, arranged in a position of grim repose, as if the man had simply laid down and waited for the end. One skeletal hand was draped over the edge of the cot, fingers curled slightly, a silent gesture of finality. The scene was a quiet tableau of absolute despair, a story told in bone and dust. The truth was immediately, shockingly clear. This was no forgotten cell. This was a burial chamber. The man inside had not escaped. He had been entombed, left to die alone in the suffocating darkness behind a wall of fresh bricks. The discovery brought the demolition to an immediate and indefinite halt. State police and forensics teams descended on the site, cordoning off the entire wing. The news exploded across West Virginia, a macabre story that resurrected the long-dead legend of Blackwood Penitentiary. The tale of the sealed cell and the skeleton found within became the headline in every local newspaper. The official story of Elias Vance, the brilliant escape artist who vanished in 1938, was not just questioned. It was violently and irrefutably shattered by this gruesome unearthing. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet university office surrounded by books on historical architecture, Leo Vance read the story online. The name Blackwood Penitentiary stopped his heart. He had grown up with the myth of his grandfather, Elias, the man who defied an unbreakable system. It was a story of defiance, of freedom, a source of complicated family pride. He had spent his career studying the very structures of confinement that had once held his ancestor, a subconscious pull he never fully examined. Now the foundation of that family legend was crumbling into dust. Leo, a meticulous and reserved man by nature, felt a cold, unfamiliar fire ignite within him. The image of the sealed cell, described in stark detail by the journalist, played over and over in his mind. The escape was a lie. The family hero was a victim. The freedom they had clung to for 41 years was a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide a monstrous crime. His grandfather hadn't run. He had been murdered in the cruelest way imaginable, his death concealed by the very institution sworn to hold him. He immediately packed a bag, his academic work forgotten. The abstract study of historical buildings suddenly felt hollow and meaningless in the face of this intensely personal and brutal reality. His grandfather's story was not a closed chapter of family folklore. It was an active crime scene. A duty he never knew he had now settled upon his shoulders with an immense weight. He had to know what happened. He had to know who was responsible. He had to reclaim his family's history from the lie that had defined it for 2 generations. Arriving at the chaotic scene in West Virginia, Leo used his academic credentials to gain limited access. He stood before the gaping hole in the corridor wall, staring into the darkness of cell 1138. The air was still thick with the smell of the tomb. He saw the state investigators moving carefully within, their sterile white suits a stark contrast to the decay. The myth of the heroic escape artist died right there, replaced by the horrifying certainty of an execution. His grandfather hadn't outsmarted Warden Finch. He had been consumed by him. This was no longer a historical curiosity for him. It was a hunt for a killer. The state police were treating it as an unidentifiable John Doe from a bygone era, a cold case with little chance of being solved. The primary suspect, Warden Alistair Finch, had died years ago, a celebrated public figure whose legacy was literally being carved into stone for a new town square monument. To the authorities, it was a tragedy lost to time. To Leo, it was a murder that had just been discovered, and the passage of time meant nothing. He formally requested access to the state archives, to every document related to Blackwood Penitentiary during Finch's tenure. He was no longer an architectural historian studying a building. He was an investigator, a grandson seeking justice for a man whose voice had been silenced 4 decades ago. He would deconstruct the official narrative, brick by brick, just as the demolition crew had torn down that wall. He would expose the truth, no matter how deep it was buried or how powerful the names attached to it were. The local historical society, deep in the process of lionizing Warden Finch, viewed his inquiries with immediate suspicion and hostility. They saw him as a troublemaker, an outsider, intent on tarnishing the reputation of a local hero. They tried to block his access to records, dismissing the discovery as a bizarre anomaly that couldn't possibly be connected to the esteemed warden. Their resistance only strengthened Leo's resolve. He knew he was getting closer to a truth they were desperate to keep buried. He spoke with the medical examiner, who confirmed the cause of death was dehydration and starvation, a slow and agonizing end. The victim had been alive when the wall was sealed. The examiner also noted that the man's hands were scraped raw, the bones of his fingertips worn down. He had tried to claw his way out. The image sent a fresh wave of cold fury through Leo. This wasn't just murder, it was torture. It was an act of unimaginable cruelty, orchestrated and hidden with cold, calculating precision. He found the original prison intake files. The physical description of Elias Vance, his height, his bone structure, a healed fracture in his left arm from a union-busting brawl, matched the forensic analysis of the skeleton perfectly. There was no longer any doubt. The man in cell 1138 was his grandfather. The state officially reopened the case of Elias Vance, changing his status from fugitive at large to homicide victim. The 41-year-old disappearance had finally become a murder investigation. Leo stood before the ruins of Blackwood as the sun set, the jagged silhouette of the prison cutting into the orange sky. The official story was a lie. The escape was a cover-up. The institution and the man who ran it were murderers. He now had a victim and a crime scene, but the killer was a ghost, protected by time and a carefully crafted legacy. Who had laid the bricks? Who had given the order? Who had benefited from silencing Elias Vance so completely? The questions swirled in his mind, each one leading to a darker, more complex possibility. The authorities saw a case that was too old, with witnesses who were likely dead and evidence that had long since turned to dust. They saw a dead end. But Leo saw a beginning. He saw a conspiracy that had been held together by a single physical barrier. Now that the wall was down, he was certain the rest of the lies would come tumbling down with it. He knew the key was not just in finding out who killed his grandfather, but in understanding why. Elias was not a common criminal. He was a political threat who had been silenced. His investigation had to go beyond the prison walls and into the web of corruption he had been trying to expose. The murder wasn't just about keeping a man in a cell. It was about burying a truth that was more dangerous than any single prisoner. The warden hadn't just built a tomb, he had constructed a vault. Leo felt a profound connection to the grandfather he had never known. Elias had fought for truth with his words and his life. Now it was Leo's turn to continue that fight. He would use his own tools, research, analysis, and a relentless pursuit of fact to uncover the conspiracy that had ended in that dark, sealed cell. The official record was a fabrication, and he would be the one to correct it, to restore his grandfather's name and expose the monster who had hidden behind a reformer's mask. The discovery of the body had answered the agonizing question of what had happened to Elias Vance. It provided a brutal, horrifying certainty that replaced decades of ambiguous myth. The family no longer had to wonder if their ancestor had abandoned them or met his end in the wilderness. They now knew he had been murdered. This terrible knowledge, however, brought with it a new and urgent question that demanded an answer. Who was responsible for his entombment? Leo's academic life was over, replaced by this singular, all-consuming mission. He was no longer just a descendant. He was the sole inheritor of his grandfather's unfinished war. The path forward was unclear, littered with faded records, dead witnesses, and the resistance of those who preferred the comfortable lie to the ugly truth. He was one man against a 41-year-old conspiracy, searching for a secret that had been sealed in stone and silence. He looked back at the prison, a dark wound in the earth. The demolition had stopped, but for Leo, the deconstruction had just begun. He would meticulously take apart Warden Finch's legacy, searching for the cracks in the facade, the inconsistencies in the official story. The skeleton in cell 1138 was the first undeniable fact, the cornerstone of a new investigation that would unravel a decades-old crime. The world believed Elias Vance had escaped. The world believed Warden Finch was a great man. Both were lies. Leo's journey would force him to confront the uncomfortable reality that history is not always written by the victors, but by those who are most successful at burying their dead. He was now the excavator, and he would not stop digging until he found every last bone of the truth. The police had their forensics, but Leo had a different kind of tool, an intimate understanding of the building itself and a burning need for personal justice. He knew that a structure like Blackwood, with its hidden passages and forgotten histories, held its own secrets. The answer wasn't just in dusty files, but in the very stones of the prison. The wall was the crime scene, but the entire penitentiary was the murder weapon. He felt the weight of his family's history, of his grandfather's silenced voice, urging him forward. This was more than just solving a murder. It was about reclaiming a name, correcting the historical record, and giving Elias Vance the justice he was so brutally denied. It was a promise made to a ghost, a vow to drag a dark secret out of its tomb and into the light, no matter the cost. The initial shock of the discovery was now hardening into a cold, determined resolve. The sealed cell was not an ending, it was a starting point. It was a clue, a grotesque signpost pointing toward a much larger conspiracy. The men who built that wall were following orders. Leo's task was to follow those orders back to their source, back to the man who commanded absolute loyalty and had the power to make a prisoner disappear from the face of the earth. The sealed cell had revealed the what. Now, Leo Vance would dedicate his life to uncovering the who and the why. This horrifying discovery was not the end of a mystery, but the explosive beginning of a new one. But this discovery was just the first piece of a macabre puzzle that nobody was prepared to assemble. Leo Vance's new life began in the cavernous, climate-controlled silence of the West Virginia State Archives. The scent of aging paper and leather-bound ledgers was a familiar comfort, but his purpose here was anything but academic. He was not studying history, he was hunting a ghost. Surrounded by towering shelves of official records, he felt the immense weight of the state's institutional memory, a memory that had been deliberately corrupted 41 years ago. His mission was to find the flaw in the official text, the single misplaced word or number that would unravel the entire fabrication of his grandfather's escape and Warden Finch's pristine legacy. This was not a search for a footnote. It was a search for a weapon. His initial days were a grueling exercise in meticulous deconstruction. He requested every document pertaining to Blackwood Penitentiary from 1935 to 1940. Inmate transfer logs, guard payroll records, maintenance requests, supply invoices, and Warden Finch's complete official correspondence. The sheer volume was staggering, a mountain of bureaucracy designed to document every aspect of prison life. Yet, for the week of Elias Vance's disappearance, the records were curiously thin, almost surgically clean. There were no unusual incident reports, no mention of security breaches beyond the official escape narrative. It was a silence so profound, so complete, that it screamed of a cover-up. The absence of chaos was the first real clue. As an architectural historian, Leo's instincts drew him to the prison's physical form. He located the original 19th century blueprints for Blackwood, their delicate paper cracked and yellowed with age. He spent 2 full days poring over the intricate drawings of the maximum security wing, tracing the lines of cell 1138 and the surrounding corridor with a magnifying glass. According to the original design, the cell was identical to all the others, a solid steel door set in a load-bearing stone wall. He then pulled the updated plans from the 1950s, the last official survey before the prison's decommissioning. There was no record, no addendum, no architect's note indicating a structural modification to that specific cell. The brick wall that had entombed his grandfather did not officially exist. This discovery was the first structural crack in the warden's fortress of lies. A major modification like sealing a cell would have required engineering approvals, budget allocations, and detailed work orders. There were none. This wasn't a sanctioned repair. It was an illegal, off-the-books construction, hidden from the very system Finch was supposed to command. Who would have the authority to order such a clandestine project without leaving a single official trace? The question was rhetorical. The answer was the man whose signature was on every other document in these archives, Warden Alistair Finch. The blueprints proved the crime was concealed not just from the public, but from the state itself. From the building's bones, Leo moved to its lifeblood, the men who walked its corridors. He cross-referenced the guard duty rosters for the week of the disappearance. The records showed a standard rotation, with one glaring exception. On the night the escape siren sounded, a four-man maintenance crew, a team typically assigned to daytime labor, was logged for an unscheduled midnight shift. Their assignment was listed with a vague single-word entry, repairs. There was no location specified, no work order number attached, and no supervisor's signature besides a rushed, almost illegible scrawl that Leo recognized from other documents as belonging to Finch himself. It was a ghost crew working in the dead of night on a phantom project. His investigation was now gaining a terrifying momentum, the pieces of a 41-year-old conspiracy beginning to lock into place. He had a non-existent wall, a phantom work crew, and the warden's personal authorization. But his inquiries did not go unnoticed. He received a formal and decidedly chilly letter from the Blackwood Historical Society. They were the self-appointed guardians of Warden Finch's legacy, a man they were actively campaigning to honor, with a bronze statue in the county seat. They expressed their deep concern that his unfounded speculation was threatening to tarnish the reputation of a great public servant based on a tragic but unexplainable anomaly. The Society's resistance was polite on the surface, but deeply obstructive in practice. When Leo requested access to their private collection of Finch's personal papers and photographs, his request was summarily denied, citing donor privacy. The Society's president, a man whose grandfather had served on the prison's board of directors, publicly dismissed Leo's efforts as the work of a grieving relative chasing conspiracies. They were closing ranks, protecting not just a man's reputation, but the comfortable, sanitized version of history they had sold to the community for decades. Their hostility was a confirmation. He was getting close to a truth they could not afford to have unearthed. Undeterred, Leo focused on the four names from the Ghost Crew's roster. He ran them through state records, Social Security databases, and military archives. The task was grimly predictable. 3 of the 4 men were dead. One had died in a suspicious hunting accident just 2 years after the escape. Another passed from a heart attack in his early 50s. The third had moved out of state and died in obscurity decades ago. The trail was cold, the witnesses silenced by time and circumstance. Was it just bad luck, or was it a sign of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the prison walls, ensuring the silence of those who knew too much? Just as he felt the investigation hitting a dead end, he found him. The fourth man, Arthur Galloway, was alive. Now 86 years old and suffering from emphysema, he was listed as a resident at the St. Jude's nursing home, less than 50 miles from the ruins of Blackwood. Leo felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a profound sense of dread. This man was the last living link to the night his grandfather was buried alive. He held the key, but after 41 years of silence, would he be willing or even able to use it? He drove to the nursing home, the weight of his family's history resting on the testimony of one frail, forgotten old man. Arthur Galloway was a whisper of a man lost in a wingback chair by a window overlooking a manicured lawn. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps, and his eyes, clouded with age, held a deep and ancient fear. When Leo introduced himself and mentioned Blackwood, a flicker of panic crossed the old man's face. He initially denied everything, claiming his memory was gone, that he couldn't recall that specific night. He was still terrified, still bound by an oath of silence made to a man who had been dead for over a decade. The warden's power, it seemed, had outlived him. Leo didn't press. Instead, he spoke of his grandfather, not as a political firebrand or a fugitive, but as a man with a family, a wife, and son who never knew what happened to him. He described the sealed cell, the skeleton on the cot, the slow death in the darkness. He painted a picture not of a crime, but of a human tragedy. He could see the walls of Arthur's fear begin to crack, worn down by the weight of a guilt he had carried for nearly half a century. The old guard's eyes welled with tears, his gnarled hands trembling as he finally decided to break his silence. In a halting, raspy voice, punctuated by coughs that shook his entire body, Arthur confessed. He recounted that night in vivid, horrifying detail. Warden Finch had pulled the four of them aside personally, his voice calm but his eyes radiating a cold intensity that promised violence. He told them they were to perform a critical structural reinforcement in the maximum security wing. He warned them that the work was a matter of state security, and that speaking of it to anyone ever would be considered an act of treason against the institution, an act with permanent consequences for them and their families. They were led to Cell 1138, where a pallet of bricks and a tub of wet mortar were already waiting. The cell's steel door had been removed from its hinges. Arthur recalled seeing a face in the darkness of the cell, a man watching them from the shadows, his expression not of fear, but of defiant contempt. And standing in the corridor, overseeing every single brick they laid, was Warden Finch himself. He didn't speak a word, simply watched with his arms crossed, his presence a silent, suffocating command. They were not guards or maintenance men that night. They were undertakers, and the warden was the master of ceremonies. The work took less than 2 hours. They were ordered to be quick and quiet. Arthur remembered the rhythmic scrape and tap of the trowels, the soft thud of bricks being set in mortar, sounds that had haunted his dreams for the rest of his life. When they laid the final brick, sealing the opening completely, Finch inspected their work with a curt nod. He then made them swear an oath of absolute secrecy on their lives before dismissing them into the pre-dawn gloom. Just as they were leaving the wing, the prison's escape siren began to scream, a piercing, artificial shriek that Arthur now understood was the final brilliant stroke of the warden's plan. Arthur's confession was a bombshell, a direct eyewitness account that implicated Finch as the architect and overseer of the murder. Leo recorded the entire testimony, his hand shaking as he held the small cassette recorder. He now had the human element, the confirmation of the conspiracy. The official narrative was not just a lie, it was a carefully staged piece of theater designed to provide cover for a cold-blooded execution. The escape siren wasn't an alert, it was a curtain call on a performance of deception, with the warden himself as the director. The manhunt, the newspaper articles, the legend, it was all part of the script. Armed with this powerful testimony, Leo successfully petitioned the state police to conduct one final, more detailed forensic sweep of the disinterred cell before the rest of the prison was leveled. He accompanied the team, his architectural knowledge proving invaluable. The investigators were focused on the walls and the cot, but Leo's attention was drawn to the floor. He noticed that one of the large flagstones near the back wall sat imperfectly in its setting, its edge raised by a fraction of an inch. A subtle detail no one else had caught. It was an imperfection in a room built for brutalist perfection. He pointed it out to the lead investigator, who initially dismissed it as simple settling. But Leo insisted, explaining that the subfloor construction would not allow for such a shift. Driven by Leo's certainty, the forensic team used a small crowbar to pry the heavy stone loose. It came up with a grating scrape of stone on stone. Beneath it was not dirt or concrete, but a small, hollowed-out cavity, and nestled inside that cavity, wrapped in what was left of an oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a small tin box no bigger than a deck of cards. The air in the cell grew thick with anticipation as the forensic technician carefully opened the rusted box. Inside was not a weapon or a jewel, but something infinitely more powerful, a small, tightly bound ledger, its pages filled with the dense, determined handwriting of Elias Vance. It was his prison journal, a record of his investigation into Finch's corruption. The team carefully transported the priceless artifact back to their lab for analysis, handling it with the reverence of a sacred text. They all knew, without a word being spoken, that they were holding the final testament of a dead man. The lab analysis of the ledger was painstaking. The final entries were written in a frantic, hurried script. Elias described his last confrontation with Finch, where the warden, realizing he was cornered, dropped all pretense of civility. Finch had openly confessed to his crimes, boasting that he was untouchable and that he had built an empire that answered to no one. He told Elias that he was a problem that needed a permanent and silent solution. The words on the page were a direct transcript of a killer's monologue, recorded by the man he was about to murder, but it was the very last entry, dated the night of his disappearance, that served as the definitive, irrefutable proof. In a few short, scribbled sentences, Elias Vance chronicled the beginning of his own burial. He wrote of watching through the narrow food slot in his cell door as the maintenance crew arrived with bricks and mortar. He described the cold, impassive look on Warden Finch's face as he stood in the corridor, directing the work. The final sentence was chillingly incomplete, ending abruptly as he described the first row of bricks blocking his view of the world. It was a real-time account of the last moments of his life. This ledger was the prova trofeo Leo had been searching for. It was more than a confession. It was a voice from the grave, a narrative of murder told by the victim himself. It was physical, undeniable, and it corroborated Arthur Galloway's testimony in every horrifying detail. The warden had not just entombed a man, he had sealed in the very evidence that would one day destroy his legacy. Elias Vance, even as he faced his own death, had managed to have the final word, a word that had waited patiently in the darkness for 41 years to be read. The discovery of the ledger transformed the investigation. It was no longer a cold case based on the fragmented memories of an old man. It was now an active homicide case with a primary suspect, Warden Alistair Finch, and a piece of evidence so powerful it was almost supernatural. The State Attorney General's office took over, classifying the ledger as the single most important piece of evidence in the state's recent history. The gears of justice, frozen for decades, began to grind back into motion, powered by the ink of a dead man's pen. Leo held a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse, the ruins of Blackwood visible in the distance behind him. He didn't speak of revenge or anger. Instead, he read the final haunting entry from his grandfather's ledger. A wave of stunned silence fell over the crowd of reporters as they listened to the words of a man describing his own entombment. The story was no longer about a mysterious skeleton. It was about the documented, premeditated murder of a political prisoner by a celebrated public official. The legend of Warden Finch was shattered in an instant. The Blackwood Historical Society immediately and publicly withdrew its proposal for the warden's statue. Their carefully constructed narrative had been obliterated by the truth, and they retreated into a humiliated silence. The community, which had once celebrated Finch as a local hero, was now forced to confront the monstrous reality of who he truly was. The name Alistair Finch was no longer a symbol of civic pride. It was a mark of shame, a testament to the community's willingness to believe a comfortable lie over an inconvenient truth. The state police, armed with the ledger and Arthur's testimony, officially closed the Elias Vance case. The cause of death was homicide. The perpetrator was Warden Alistair Finch, who had acted as judge, jury, and executioner. The motive was the silencing of a man who threatened to expose his corrupt empire. The official record, which had stood for 41 years, was formally amended. The word escaped was struck, and the word murdered was put in its place. It was a small administrative change that represented a seismic shift in history. Leo's work was not yet done. He had uncovered the who, the how, and the why. He had proven his grandfather was murdered by the very man sworn to uphold the law, but proving a crime and achieving justice were two different things. The killer was long dead, beyond the reach of any court. What would justice for Elias Vance even look like? How could a 41-year-old crime be truly rectified? The emotional resolution was still out of reach. A final chapter that had yet to be written. He stood once more before the sealed opening of cell 1138, the police tape now removed. He had deconstructed the lie, piece by painstaking piece. He had followed a trail of whispers and ghosts, of faded ink and forgotten blueprints, to arrive at the terrible truth. He had given his grandfather his voice back, allowing him to speak his truth across a chasm of 4 decades. The investigation had provided the facts, but it couldn't heal the wound that had been carved into his family's history. The ledger had provided a factual climax, a definitive answer to the central mystery. But it also opened a new, more profound question. If a man like Warden Finch, so publicly lauded and celebrated, could commit such a monstrous act and conceal it for so long, how many other secrets were buried in the foundations of their institutions? How many other official histories were just well-managed lies? The murder of Elias Vance was not an isolated anomaly. It was a symptom of a much deeper corruption. Leo realized that the investigation had never been just about his grandfather. It was about the nature of power and the fragility of truth. Finch had wielded his power to erase a man, to rewrite history in his own image. He had almost succeeded. It was only through a combination of chance, persistence, and the victim's own incredible foresight that the truth had been clawed back from the darkness. The fight was not just against a single dead warden, but against the system of silence that enabled him. He thought of the other names in his grandfather's ledger, the corrupt officials, the corporate bosses, the silent partners in Finch's schemes. The warden was the killer, but was he the only one who was guilty? Who else had benefited from Elias Vance's permanent silence? The conspiracy was deeper than a single cell, and the rot extended far beyond the prison walls. The ledger was not just an account of a murder, it was a map. The reconstruction of the timeline was complete. The sequence of events on that terrible night in 1938 was now known in chilling detail. The official narrative had been dismantled and replaced with a brutal, verifiable truth. But the process had revealed that the crime was larger than the entombment of one man. It was a conspiracy with roots that were still alive, still connected to powerful interests in the state. Exposing the murder was only the first step. Leo felt a cold resolve settle over him. He had avenged his grandfather's death by uncovering the truth. Now he would honor his grandfather's life by finishing his work. He would take the names in that ledger and follow the trail of corruption wherever it led. The investigation into the murder was over, but the war Elias Vance had started 41 years ago was about to begin again, with a new soldier on the front lines. The evidence was now absolute, the timeline clear. The questions of what happened in cell 1138 and who was responsible had been answered beyond any doubt. The mystery was solved. But the truth Leo was beginning to understand was a far more complex and dangerous thing than a simple solution. It demanded not just acknowledgement, but action. The ledger was a trophy, but it was also a torch. He had exposed the monster, but now he had to dismantle the monster's legacy. The physical wall had been torn down by a demolition crew, and the wall of lies had been torn down by his investigation. But the institutional walls that protected men like Finch still stood. The discovery of the truth was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of the beginning. What Leo Vance didn't realize was that by opening his grandfather's tomb, he had also opened a Pandora's box of secrets, and some of the people who benefited from those secrets were still very much alive, and they would not give up their power without a fight. The past was not as dead as he thought. the discovery of Elias Vance's ledger was not an end, but a violent and brilliant beginning. For Leo, the pages were more than a confirmation of murder. They were a map of a conspiracy that had poisoned the state for nearly half a century. Warden Finch had not acted alone. Elias's meticulous notes named his accomplices: a powerful state senator, a ruthless coal baron, and 2 members of the prison's board of directors. The warden was the brutal instrument of their will, and Blackwood Penitentiary was their private bank, laundering profits from illegal inmate labor. The entombment of Elias Vance was not just murder, it was the burial of a corporate ledger, a silencing of the one man who could bring their entire empire crashing down. Leo understood now that Warden Finch's legacy was not just a statue or a name on a building. It was a living, breathing network of power, passed down through generations. The descendants of the men named in the ledger now occupied the highest echelons of West Virginia's legal, political, and financial worlds. The most prominent among them was Judge Alistair Finch, Jr., a man who had built his career on his father's manufactured reputation for integrity and order. He was the gatekeeper of the lie, the living embodiment of a history that had been meticulously falsified. To truly achieve justice, Leo knew he had to confront the son who inherited the kingdom built on his grandfather's bones. The confrontation took place not in a dark alley or a courtroom, but in the hallowed, wood-paneled chambers of Judge Finch. The room was a monument to the Finch legacy, dominated by a stern, oil-painted portrait of the warden himself. The judge, a man in his late 60s with his father's cold, commanding eyes, greeted Leo with an air of dismissive authority. He spoke of his father as a misunderstood visionary, dismissing Leo's investigation as the obsessive fantasy of a grieving man seeking to defame a public servant. His denial was smooth, practiced, and utterly devoid of genuine emotion, a performance polished by decades of repetition. Leo did not argue or raise his voice. He simply placed a high-quality photocopy of the final page of his grandfather's ledger on the judge's immense mahogany desk. The frantic final words of Elias Vance, describing the warden's cold gaze as the first bricks were laid, stood in stark contrast to the room's opulent order. Judge Finch's composure fractured for a single, telling second. His eyes darted from the page to Leo, a flicker of inherited panic betraying the calm facade. He quickly recovered, scoffing at the document as a pathetic forgery, a desperate fiction created to tarnish a great man's name. But Leo had anticipated this. He knew the ledger, while powerful, could be contested by a man with enough influence. He had spent weeks poring over every word, every number, every stray mark his grandfather had made. In the margin of an entry detailing Finch's financial crimes, Elias had scribbled a seemingly random sequence of numbers and a single word: Allegheny. It was not a code, Leo realized, but a key. It was the account number and the name of the bank where Finch had hidden his personal records, a detail Elias must have overheard and documented, a final seed of truth planted for the future. This ledger was my grandfather's testimony, Leo stated, his voice steady and clear. But it also served as his last will. It left me an inheritance. Wait. He slid a second document across the desk, a court order signed by a federal judge authorizing the immediate opening of a safe deposit box held by the Allegheny Trust Bank since 1937 under the name of Alistair Finch. The judge's face went pale, the blood draining from it as he stared at the official seal. The carefully constructed wall of denial, which had stood for over 40 years, crumbled into dust in an instant. His father's fortress had finally been breached, not by force, but by a dead man's memory. The air in the bank vault was cold and still, thick with the smell of old money and forgotten secrets. The bank manager, flanked by federal marshals, used 2 keys to open the long, dormant safe deposit box. Inside was not a trove of cash or bonds, but a single, meticulously organized leather satchel. As Leo and the marshals looked on, its contents were carefully laid out on a sterile viewing table. There were detailed financial statements, a shadow ledger that perfectly mirrored the crimes Elias Vance had described, implicating every man he had named. It was the complete architecture of the conspiracy, preserved in the warden's own hand. But there was something else, something far more personal and damning. At the bottom of the satchel lay a small tarnished silver object, a union pin, bearing the insignia of the Miners' Guild Elias Vance had organized. It was the warden's trophy, a personal memento of his ultimate victory over the man who dared to challenge him. Alongside it was a sealed envelope addressed to the governor of West Virginia in Finch's elegant script. The letter was never sent, but its contents served as the final absolute confession. It was a chilling, self-aggrandizing manifesto in which Finch justified the murder of Elias Vance as a necessary and permanent solution to protect the state's industrial stability from a dangerous radical. The letter was a window into the mind of a sociopath, a man who saw murder as a tool of administration and his victim as a mere obstacle to be removed. He wrote of the entombment with a chilling detachment, praising its efficiency and its narrative power. The staged escape, he boasted, was his masterstroke, a way to transform a martyr into a coward and an execution into a folk tale. The letter was not an apology, it was a proud declaration of his absolute power, a final, arrogant testament from a man who believed he was above God and the law, a man who believed his secrets would die with him, locked away in steel and stone. The contents of the safe deposit box were a legal firestorm. The unsent letter and the financial records were irrefutable. They provided not only a confession to the murder, but a detailed roadmap of the decades-long criminal enterprise Finch had commanded. The union pin was the final, visceral touch, a piece of Elias Vance himself, held captive alongside the proof of his killer's guilt. The truth was no longer a matter of historical debate. It was a matter of public record, a series of undeniable facts that could not be spun, dismissed, or buried. Warden Finch, the celebrated reformer, was now officially unmasked as a murderer and a mob boss. The public fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the families involved. Judge Alistair Finch, Jr. resigned from the bench in utter disgrace, his name and career irrevocably destroyed by the sins of his father. The federal prosecutor, armed with the warden's shadow ledger, launched a massive racketeering investigation. Indictments were handed down to the grandsons and corporate heirs of the men Elias Vance had tried to expose 41 years earlier. The comfortable lie the community had lived with for decades was ripped away, replaced by a brutal and shameful truth that forced a complete re-evaluation of its own history. The statue was never spoken of again. For the Vance family, the resolution was profound and bittersweet. The state of West Virginia issued a formal public apology. Elias Vance's name was officially cleared of the sedition charges, his conviction posthumously overturned. A small, dignified memorial was erected on the now cleared grounds where Blackwood Penitentiary once stood, its simple plaque honoring him not as a fugitive, but as a tireless advocate for justice who was murdered for speaking the truth. His official cause of death was listed as homicide, the final administrative correction to a 41-year-old lie. It was a quiet victory, but a complete one. Leo stood at the memorial site weeks later, long after the press and politicians had departed. The mountain air was clean, and wildflowers were beginning to grow where the oppressive shadow of the prison had once fallen. He held the small silver union pin in his hand, returned to him by the authorities. It felt heavy, a small object that carried the weight of a lifetime of struggle and an unyielding commitment to justice. He had started this journey to reclaim his family's history, to solve a mystery, but he had ended up finishing his grandfather's war. The silence had been broken. he gently placed the pin at the base of the memorial stone, a final return of a stolen legacy. The ghost of Elias Vance was finally at peace, his story told, his name restored. Leo felt the immense weight on his shoulders finally lift, replaced by a quiet, somber sense of closure. The anger and the need for vengeance had faded, leaving behind a deep respect for the man he had come to know through faded ink and a desperate fight for the truth. He had not just found a body, he had resurrected a hero from a tomb of lies, ensuring his voice would now be heard forever. The story of Elias Vance became a new kind of legend in West Virginia. No longer a tale of a clever escape, it was now a cautionary saga about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the enduring strength of the truth. It served as a permanent reminder that history is not always what is written in official records, but what is proven by facts, no matter how long they have been buried. The community was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that they had celebrated a monster and forgotten a martyr, a lesson that reshaped their civic identity. Justice, Leo realized, is not always about punishment. With the main perpetrator long dead, it was about correction. It was about dismantling the architecture of a lie, brick by brick, until the true foundation was revealed. It was about ensuring that the victim, not the killer, had the final word. Warden Finch had sought to control the narrative forever, to write the final chapter of Elias Vance's life. But he had failed to account for the persistence of memory and the relentless dedication of a grandson he could never have imagined. The demolition of Blackwood had been a physical act, but Leo's investigation had been a demolition of a different sort. He had torn down a false legacy, leveled a corrupt dynasty, and cleared the ground for a more honest history to be built. The process had been arduous and painful, a journey into the darkest corners of human cruelty and deception. Yet, it had yielded a resolution that was as complete and undeniable as the skeleton found in that sealed, forgotten cell. The case was, in every sense of the word, closed. The sun began to set over the Appalachian peaks, casting long shadows across the peaceful landscape. Where a fortress of despair once stood, there was now only open space and the quiet promise of renewal. Leo felt a profound connection to the grandfather he never met, a bond forged across time by a shared, unbreakable belief in the truth. He had fulfilled a silent covenant, answering a 41-year-old question and delivering a final, long-overdue measure of peace to his family. The final resolution was not loud or triumphant, but a quiet, internal settling. The emotional wounds carried by 2 generations of his family could finally begin to heal. The ambiguity that had haunted them was replaced by the hard certainty of the truth, however horrifying it was. Elias Vance was no longer a ghost in a family myth. He was an ancestor, a man whose principles had cost him his life, but had ultimately triumphed over the powerful forces that sought to erase him from history. The ledger, the Union pin, and the warden's confession were now part of the state historical record, permanent and unassailable. They served as the evidence not only of a crime, but of the immense effort required to bring it to light. The story of Blackwood was now a testament to the fact that no wall is thick enough, no lie is strong enough, and no amount of time is long enough to permanently bury the truth. It always finds a way to surface, carried forward by those who refuse to let the dead remain silent. Leo Vance left the mountains of West Virginia not as the academic who had arrived, but as the guardian of a legacy. He had learned that history is not a passive collection of facts, but an active pursuit of justice. His grandfather had fought his battle with speeches and picket lines. Leo had fought his with blueprints and archives. Both had faced down a corrupt system, armed with nothing but the conviction that the truth, once revealed, is the most powerful weapon of all. The entombment of Elias Vance was an act of profound evil, designed to create a perfect, unending silence. Warden Finch believed he had achieved it. He believed he had crafted a flawless crime, hidden behind a masterful lie. He had successfully silenced a man's voice, his body, and his work for 41 years. But in the end, the truth proved to be louder than the silence, more enduring than stone, and more powerful than the warden's carefully constructed tomb. The final justice for Elias Vance was not found in a courtroom verdict against a dead man. It was found in the simple, undeniable fact that his story was finally being told, correctly and completely. It was the ultimate victory of memory over erasure, of fact over fiction. The warden had tried to write the end of the story, but he was merely a dark chapter in a much longer book. The final page belonged to the man he had tried to bury. Leo's journey had been one of deconstruction, but it ended with a restoration. He had restored his grandfather's name, his family's honor, and a small piece of the historical record that had been deliberately broken. The emotional closure was not one of happiness, but of profound and solemn satisfaction. He had looked into the abyss of his family's past and had not turned away. He had faced the monster and, by dragging his crimes into the light, had destroyed him for a second and final time. The story of Blackwood served as a powerful testament to a single, unyielding principle. It demonstrated that secrets, no matter how deeply they are buried in the earth or in the official records, possess a strange and patient gravity. They pull on the future, demanding to be known, waiting for the one person persistent enough to start digging. The truth does not decay, it simply waits. And in the case of Elias Vance, it had waited 41 years for a locked door to be opened and a story to be set free. The silence that had fallen over cell 1138 in 1938 was absolute, but it was not permanent. It was a silence that was always destined to be broken. The final revelation was a testament to the idea that no one can truly be erased. A person's life, their principles, and their fight for what is right can leave an echo so powerful that it can reverberate through generations, eventually becoming loud enough to tear down prison walls and expose the darkest of secrets. Leo had come seeking answers about a man's disappearance, but he found the story of a man's unwavering stand. He had sought the truth about a death, but he had ended up illuminating a life. The emotional resolution was the quiet understanding that his grandfather had not died in vain. His final desperate act of documenting his own murder had been an act of incredible faith, a belief that one day someone would come looking for the truth, and that his words, waiting in the darkness, would be enough. The true climax was not the confrontation with a killer's son, but the moment the world was forced to listen to the victim's voice. The ledger was Elias Vance's final speech, delivered 4 decades after his death, and it proved to be the most powerful one he ever gave. It was a speech that dismantled an empire, rewrote history, and delivered a form of justice that was more complete and poetic than any court could have ever provided. The legacy of Blackwood was no longer defined by the warden who ran it, but by the prisoner he could not silence. The emotional resolution for Leo, and for the historical record, was the final, righteous inversion of power. The man who was buried had risen up through the weight of history to condemn his killer, proving that some truths are inevitable, and some voices, no matter how violently they are suppressed, will ultimately refuse to be entombed.